It had been less than 2 decades since the Wright brothers had lifted up from Earth to become the first men to fly under their own power and control. Since that historic day, aviation had moved from the exclusive realm of visionary engineers and daredevil pilots to become a worldwide fascination. Newer and better planes were fast replacing those flying machines of aviation's early years as more and more people took to the skies to experience for themselves the joys and mysteries that lay above the clouds. Now, with the war over, the dream of flight was about to take another giant leap into the future.
November 11th, 1918. Everyone celebrated the armistice in the Times Squares of the world.
When the survivors of the Great War came home, they brought their love of flying with them. It was in their blood. A country at peace had no need for warplanes, and the returning pilots could pick up a tired old DH-4 or Curtiss Jenny for almost nothing. They simply painted out the military insignia on their planes, and they were in business, traveling around the country, putting on exhibitions and selling rides for whatever the market would bear. It was a difficult and sometimes dangerous life. But we were flyers, said barnstormer Earl C. Reed, and that whole vast sky out there belonged to us alone, and that was enough.
By the time I was 17, I had studied books on aviation and engines and airplanes and flying more than I studied my school lessons. And I helped a barnstorming pilot all that summer, selling tickets and working on his airplane. So at the end of the summer, the airplane, which was in atrocious condition, just unbelievably atrocious, he gave it to me. And I proceeded to teach myself to fly in that airplane. It was a World War I Jenny, a Canadian Jenny. I wouldn't attempt it again. Teaching myself to fly was a rather risky proposition. But I did have a book, and I studied every word of that book and practiced taxiing on the airplane for about a month. And then I was able to get it just barely above the ground, crossing the field, and that taught me to keep the wings level. And finally, one day, I had to take off because I thought I was going to run into the wall at the other side of the field, so I took off. And I had quite a job getting that airplane down. I suppose it took an hour and a half or 2 hours before I got it on the ground finally, after many attempts. But I didn't bust it.
They called themselves barnstormers, men and women who flew simply because they loved to fly.
I would send out thousands of penny postcards in the farming country, and I would bring a huge crowd to some farm field, and I would carry passengers for $1 a head. It was unbelievably short rides. To make 250 to 350 flights in a day, the flights were only about 35 seconds. To take off and do a wing over and come back downwind and do another wing over and land and roll right up to the same spot. There was no taxiing involved, no loss of time, and I had a pit crew that could get the passengers loaded and unloaded at the same time, out one side of the airplane and in the other, and away we'd go. And they didn't even have down on their seats by that time. They were not even sitting down most of the time when we took off. And the ride was very brief, and actually I found that's what they wanted, a brief ride to see what it was like. And about, I would say 25% of them went right back and bought more tickets to have another short ride. It was a real roller coaster ride.
For those barnstorming pilots who weren't going from town to town selling airplane rides to a fascinated public, there was another, more daring way to earn a living in the skies high above the earth.
One of the uses to which warplanes, the old warplanes were put, and some of the trainer planes, was that the pilots who came back from the war, and they were the only people skilled enough to fly these airplanes, they got the idea of this barnstorming. You've heard of barnstorming. And they used to go around with these aerial circuses, and they used to do all kinds of stunting. It really was an aerial circus. They used to do acrobatic stunts with their airplanes, looping the loop and rolling and so on. Then daredevil co-pilots used to go out and walk on the wings, wing walking. Then ladies used to do it, and then people used to dangle upside down. There were a lot of people killed. And the whole effort of these barnstormers was to persuade people that flying was a very dangerous thing to do. And they were very brave men, and please put $5 in the hat.
The legacy of yesterday's stunt pilots and devil-may-care wing walkers has not been lost with the passage of time. Today, men and women from throughout the world still carry on the traditions of those who came before them.
I don't know whether legacy is really the right word for what we're doing, but it's a great honor and to carry on the history that was created by the people that originally did this and paved the way for us to be able to get out and do the air shows and reincarnate, so to speak, the barnstormers. You kind of are willing to accept the risk that's involved because of that.
I think really just not much change at all in the show itself. The show is as much pizzazz as possible to make it as exciting as possible and still safe, which really was the same thing that they were doing then. We may take a few more safety measures at this point simply because we know more because of that legacy that they did give us.
I actually have a connection with a person who has preceded me. I've had the very great privilege and honor to be able to meet and make very close acquaintance with Jessie Woods,
Yes.
who started in 1928 and rode through 1939, I believe she said, and she reminds me every time I see her that you know why I did this, Cheryl, don't you? And I said, yes, Jessie, I know. And she said, we were starving. We needed to eat. And they literally would go from town to town to try to make enough money to buy food to sustain them.
Back in the 20s and early 30s, that was about the only way to make a living flying. If you could go out in the country and get a crowd, you could make better money. So that was the reason I did it.
You've got people that want to do it, passionately devoted to flying, and off they go across the country hopping airplane rides, trying to eke out a living. They didn't know how they were going to do it, but they just wanted to try. And the Barnstormers had the chance to bring aviation, even in its simplest form, to each and every little town. And so it forced the real American public to accept that airplanes are really a permanent thing, and this flying is not just a fad, and it's not just something that we're going to use in wartime and that's it, but it can come to every little town. And the little towns, this is before mail service, before any kind of commercial service at all.
It's May 15th, 1918, in the nation's capital, and the U.S. mail heads for its first trip by air. The load is 136 pounds, and its destination is the city of New York. President Wilson adds prestige and a letter to this historic event.
Some of those wartime aviators who weren't barnstorming across the country found employment with the newly established U.S. Airmail Service when it began its flights in 1918. The first transcontinental run was made in 1924 when a military surplus DH-4 biplane carried the mail from New York to San Francisco. Flying at night and in all kinds of weather to stay on schedule, the early airmail service pilots paid a very heavy human toll. Of the 40 pilots originally hired by the United States Post Office, only 9 were still alive by 1925.
After the impact of the First World War had subsided, the air industry was in decline because there were lots of surplus warplanes. That's what the U.S. airmail started with, the converted warplanes with the pilot with his head outside and his goggles and so on. They could only fly at about 100 miles an hour, round figure, 100 miles an hour, which wasn't all that much faster than trains when you think about it. They didn't have much range either. So it wasn't all that much quicker to fly, and certainly a lot more dangerous and a lot more uncomfortable. Nobody was really interested in building an airline network as yet. There were sort of lots of plans, but this was regarded by most people as just a dream.
It may have been only a dream for some, but there were others who were hard at work turning the dream of passenger-carrying airlines into reality. As early as 1919, the fledgling Aero Limited Company sold passage on their flights between New York and Atlantic City for $100 per ticket, flying amphibian planes powered by pusher-type engines. At the same time, European entrepreneurs were developing commercial airlines that would begin providing passenger service throughout the continent. Very quickly, the dreamers from both sides of the Atlantic realized that as the number of travelers increased, so must the size of the airplanes, along with passenger service and comfort.
Departing from the widely held view in the early and mid-20s that the airplane was primarily of use for carrying the mail very quickly. And so with the passing of the Kelly Airmail Act of 1925 and the Air Commerce Act of 1926, embryo airlines were formed in the United States. And at first they were flying rather primitive airplanes with maximum of perhaps 4 or 5 people, passenger accommodation, with a pilot who still flew with his head outside the cabin. And very neatly, as American industry is apt to do, very neatly realizing the potential and working on it, the people who flew aeroplanes and the people who promoted aeronautics began to realize that the aeroplane could be used as quite seriously as a form of public transport.
The entrepreneurs of commercial aviation weren't the only ones developing new flying machines to venture higher into the skies. Having learned the importance of aviation in combat, the military was also making major contributions to the development and testing of new aviation technology.
It's 1923 at the Dayton, Ohio airport. The crew of a tri-wing Bomber bomber board giant airship in test flight of then biggest, heavier-than aircraft ever built.
As aviation's second decade was drawing to a close, aircraft technology was reaching new heights of safety and reliability. In the 1920s, flight testing was being done to improve the performance of engines, airframes, and instruments. Among the most flamboyant of those early test pilots was one James Harold Jimmy Doolittle. Considered a daredevil by many, he was actually a highly professional pilot. At the Schneider International Seaplane Races in October of 1925, Doolittle flew his R-3C2 float plane at speeds of up to 232 miles per hour, gaining another victory in record-setting time. This was just one of many world records that would be amassed by the daring young aviator. Jimmy Doolittle and this new generation of pilots would not be satisfied with mere flight. They were determined to take their new machines into the heart of the ancient mystery, to do what no man had ever done before.
May 16th, 1919, an historic day in aviation. Start of the first flight ever to be made across the Atlantic. 3 American flying boats made the attempt from Newfoundland. This is the NC-3, later to be forced down with her sister ship, the NC-1. But one of the flying pioneers did make it, made it in 11 days after the takeoff. And here it is, the trailblazing NC-4.
The only ones who'd flown a heavier-than-air aircraft across the Atlantic was in the NC-4 in 1919. It was a remarkable flight. It was a big 4-engine flying boat. I happen to know personally the pilot, one of the two pilots on that airplane, Walter Hinton. And he was a remarkable man, and it was a remarkable flight because it was all night in fog. And I don't really see how he did it. They did not have navigational instruments in those days except an ordinary magnetic compass. No horizon, none of the instruments we have today.
Actually, only 42 hours were spent in the air, but it was not until May 27th that the flying ship was set down at its destination, Lisbon, Portugal, after stop-offs at the Azores.
Later on, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown flew a Vickers Vimy bomber from Newfoundland to Ireland successfully. Those are the only ones who had actually made flights across the Atlantic successfully in a heavier-than-air airplane up until Lindbergh.
The pioneer aviators of the 1920s were not only testing new aircraft that would take the dream of flight another step toward the future, they were also pushing their machines farther into the skies in search of another aviation first. On October 8, 1922, Lillian Gatlin became the first woman ever to fly across the United States. She made her transcontinental journey in just over 27 hours. Later, the pioneer aviatrix would go on to successfully compete in some of the nation's most prestigious air races.
Fokker T-2, which was the first airplane to fly nonstop across the United States, flew from Long Island to San Diego in 1923. Two pilots in it. They flew for just a few minutes under 27 hours. But it was the first time the continent had ever been crossed nonstop. Then the next year, in 1924, the Douglas World Cruiser that we have downstairs was one of two airplanes. 4 started out, 2 completed it, that flew around the world. It took just under 6 months to fly around the world with about 70 landings. But they did it. I mean, it was a tremendous logistics effort as well as a flying triumph.
It's May 9th, 1926. Navy Commander Richard Evelyn Byrd is about to join pilot Floyd Bennett on an historic journey. In their giant Fokker, they lift off from the icy waters of the Arctic for their first flight over the top of the world. Destination, North Pole and return.
In 1926, just 17 years after Admiral Peary became the first person to reach the North Pole, Commander Richard Evelyn Byrd and pilot Floyd Bennett lifted their Fokker F-7-3M off the ice and became the first men to fly over that northernmost point of the Earth.
Mission is accomplished as Byrd and Bennett get warm welcome.
But the triumphs of the skies were only just beginning. Soon, another young pilot would lift off into the heavens to begin a flight that would change the world forever.
May 1927, Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis. Charles A. Lindbergh just before the epic flight with his mother. The Spirit of St. Louis is towed onto the field in the pre-dawn dusk. Machine and pilot are about to join hands to make history.
After more than 2 decades, flight was still seen by many as a dangerous, daredevil sort of thing. The pursuit of barnstorming gypsies, aerial adventurers, and visionary engineers. But when Charles Lindbergh climbed aboard his Spirit of St. Louis and flew alone, non-stop from New York to Paris, the dream of flight became a promise, and the world would never be quite the same again.
Charles Lindbergh was, in fact, a watershed figure in the history of aviation. In the first place, he did something that no one else had done. He made the solo flight across the Atlantic for the first time from New York to Paris. But it was this image that he had. He was young, he was tall, he was slim, good-looking, had tousled hair. He was just irresistible. You know, he was a kid next door. He was the son every mother wanted to have. And here was this young, heroic, good-looking guy who used technology to go off and attack a new frontier.
33.5 hours later, 30,000 jam Paris-Lamberger Airport to Great Lindy. And here, the first man to cross the Atlantic alone.
Lindbergh's solo flight demonstrated a number of important items of technology that were going to become important over the next decade. Reliable engine, for example. New sorts of instruments like the Earth Inductor Compass. And that flight really was a demonstration of what was to come. You couldn't fly passengers across the Atlantic yet, but clearly that day was going to arrive in the not too distant future.
In May of 1927, Charles Lindbergh changed the world of flight forever. Lindbergh's heroic adventure brought aviation from the realm of daredevil stunt pilots and barnstormers into the mainstream of everyday life. He also set the scene for men like Boeing, Douglas, and Northrop to develop newer and better aircraft that would begin turning flights of fancy into flights of commerce, with such planes as the Ford and Stinson trimotors, the Boeing 247, and the revolutionary Douglas DC-3. In the minds and imaginations of the public, a new era of aviation began when, on a misty spring morning, Lucky Lindy lifted up into the skies in search of his own dreams of flight.
International Video Network brings you the greatest adventures in video entertainment. Award-winning documentaries from Reader's Digest, exploring the masterworks of man and nature. Travel planning videos from Fodors, revealing looks at the people, places, and cultures of the world. Rand McNally Video Expeditions, taking you to some of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth. Rand McNally Video Travelers, whirlwind tours you can enjoy from the comfort of your living room. Super Cities, celebrating the best-loved cities of the world. And Video Visits, whisking you away to exotic, romantic, and popular destinations. International Video Network. Great adventures in video. See your local video retailer or call International Video Network at 1-800-669-4486, extension 850 for your free catalog, featuring more than 250 travel, documentary, and special interest videos.